just thinking. Wipe it off.
So we're at, that's perfect. Thanks for rounding that. use that so we were all understanding of what it means to be a low wage worker in America, but then they also have to go out and I give them, I don't have much to ask this person anymore, but I give them what is the industry standard for that person. And then they have to take that hour and pay however many hours a week that person works and figure out all the things. Go out and find housing in the community and go grocery shopping together and figure out all the things. One thing those things because you have to all go out and say, oh, I made money $1.20. And you know, if they're all have this things like grads, they're heroic, they're problem solvers, and you know, so they're gonna give that, imagine getting that every day. You know, so you're gonna have ramen every day. Anyway, so they do all of that, and then you know, they've done all that to make them have a child. What if you ask what it was for your parents? Yeah, so they have to go back and find a lot of that. It's where I said I would probably see how much take your kids, school. So it's kind of right in the students. And they can't use computers unless they come to the library. They have to walk a couple buses. Yeah, so it's a big way for them. Do they ever say yep, so many of them already know about it, especially if you're first year of AIDS. Social resources. But anyway, they'll say, well, I'm going to take advantage of it. But again, a lot of times they call us as part of our
You know where Tom's good?
first off, and don't know about working all the time.
Is
Very first time I come up that first in Mississippi or did that project, had these, I decided I would never have single set screws, never have all eyes. Yeah, I just had this as their host job. Hey, how are you doing? Cindy Sharon. That's me.
Hi. Nice to see you again. I'm Cindy Rock. The reason I'm invited here, I'm on the selection committee for the Great Falls Forum, and I was the one that said, when I kept reading about all the courses and everything, I said, I think we should find out this. It's really nice. So, yeah.
But she says it would.
Oh, nice. So,
She's doing a dipsy.
Cindy, would you like a water?
yeah.
Street goes high.
Oh,
They do it at
a lot of the same.
25.
Yeah, you're right. My daughter said, did you
My favorite Democrat. And I don't have too many.
Oh, yeah, you should. You should have a lot.
Yeah, I know.
It's like a local version. Yes.
I'm a person people rather than party. You and Peggy and oh wow.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
People out there, so everything's okay.
Generally fairly good. It's a good day for that. First real meeting when they're part of the
Good going on. I was sitting
everybody. We are going to get started here. Thank you so much for coming out today to the library. My name is Darby Ray at Word Center for Community Partnerships, and I serve on the board of the library place today while he's out of town. I want to begin with a couple of announcements. First, our Sunday author series kicks off this Sunday at 1 p.m. in this very space, featuring, this is very exciting, Nuruddin Farah. He's going to be talking about his latest novel, which is Hiding in Plain Sight. His writing career has spanned 4 continents and an equal number of decades. He was born and raised in Somalia and is described by Salman Rushdie as, quote, one of the finest contemporary African novelists. So we're very excited to welcome Nuruddin Farah to this room this Sunday at 1 p.m. for our author series. Farah has been a candidate for the last several years for the Nobel Prize in Literature, so he's quite a fine writer, and we're excited to have him. Other authors in this series, just to be keeping an eye out for, are Congressman Barney Frank, who will be here to talk about his most recent book, Doug Hodgkin and Kate Braystrup. At each of these events, books will be available for sale and signing by the author, but you can just come and listen to them and not buy the book if you'd like. The next Great Falls Forum, which is the series we're here with today, will feature Penobscot Nation Chief Kirk Francis, whom you may have heard this morning on MPBN. Chief Francis will speak on the topic Penobscot Tribal Sovereignty and the Maine Environment. That forum will be in this lovely hall on Thursday, November 19th at noon, and I hope you'll come to that. So, on to today. Today's Great Falls Forum will feature, first, it's sponsored by the library, Bates College, and the Sun Journal. And we are delighted to have 2 outstanding members of the Maine Public Broadcasting Network's news division. Mal Leary was not able to be here today due to an unexpected family obligation, and he sends his apologies. But the work of the team is well represented here today. I'd like to introduce Susan Sharon to you, for those who don't know her. She's the Deputy News Director at MPBN, who handles assignments and planning by the news staff. She's also a general assignment reporter who began her career at MPBN working at the State House in 1992. Since then, she's covered major political and environmental stories, winning national awards for her beat reporting twice from the Society for Environmental Journalists. Her coverage of labor issues, including an investigative series on independent contractors, has also been recognized by the Public Radio News Directors, Inc. and by the Associated Press. Susan is a graduate of the University of Montana, where she got her first job in public radio news while still a student. And this is kind of a theme you'll hear in just a second. She's also worked at television stations in Montana and Maine. And then we have Patty Wight, who joined MPBN after working as a freelance radio reporter. She's produced pieces for national public radio programs such as All Things Considered and Morning Edition. She produced a 5-part documentary series on Maine's gubernatorial campaign for Maine Things Considered in 2010. She also taught at the SALT Institute for Documentary Studies in Portland, where she first got hooked on radio as a student herself in 2000. After graduating, she immediately sought an internship with MPBN and is happy to be a reporter there now. As an evergreen member, I am especially delighted to welcome Susan and Patty to be with us today. So, let's turn cell phones off. That's a good one. And we're just going to let them share their experiences, and then when they're ready, you all can just say we're ready for questions, and you can coordinate that from where you are. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Okay, perfect. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much for having us. We are sorry that Mal couldn't join us, but Patty and I actually, we're grateful to the rest of our news team, because they are the ones that actually help us be here today by taking on our work, and they were also a part of covering the story that we're going to tell you today. And that is a story about a woman named Kaci Hickox, whose name you might remember. Some of you might know her as the Ebola nurse. She doesn't really like that term, it turns out, because she never did get Ebola. She was a medical worker who returned to the United States from volunteering with Doctors Without Borders from Maine, came back to the United States about a year ago, just about this time of year. And if you'll recall, at that time, in the news, every night we were seeing these really horrible stories about people in Africa and fear about the Ebola virus spreading to other parts of the world. So the country was on pretty high alert about this. There was a lot of fear. States were starting to develop protocols about how to handle people returning, what were we going to do about high-risk travelers, etc. And here comes Kaci, who has just returned from Sierra Leone, where she has volunteered in some of the most dire conditions in the world. She comes back to New Jersey, which only hours earlier had adopted some of these protocols, right?
Right. Yeah, a protocol where basically anyone who came into contact with Ebola patients was going to be in a quarantine. And so when she touched down in the airport, she had no idea that there was this new protocol, and she was held there ultimately for several hours while airport personnel and health personnel were trying to figure out what to do because they knew that she was coming from Sierra Leone and treating Ebola patients. And during that time, they took her temperature and it was elevated, and she has said since that her temperature was elevated because she was flustered because of what she was going through. But she was transported to a tent outside of a hospital and kept there. And the way that the country heard about this story was that she wrote a first-person piece for the Dallas Morning News, and that came out on a Monday morning, and everywhere media outlets started to pick up on it, and we picked up on it, as did a lot of other ones in Maine, because Kaci had been living in Maine, and that's where she was trying to get home to.
Right, and just a little bit more about that Dallas Morning News piece. The first-person account really propelled her again into the national media because she was talking about this rough treatment that she'd gotten in New Jersey, where she felt like she was somebody being accused of a crime. Instead, she's this healthcare worker who has only had the most humane interest for other people in the world, and she's being grilled for 7 hours and given a granola bar and a glass of water. And so she writes about this and writes about how the hysteria in the press is making her worried about the returning healthcare workers to this country. So then she's being invited to be on national television, and we are learning that she's from Maine, and she gets an attorney, to negotiate basically her release from New Jersey. But then we're like, oh my, now she's going to be coming to Maine. And so it's going to be a big story for all of us in Maine. And we don't know, we knew she was from Fort Kent, but we don't know where she's going to return to Maine and how the state is going to respond and how her community is going to respond in this climate that we're in. And so we are trying to predict in our small newsroom, how are we going to cover this story?
And so that first day, we just did a story about, okay, so here's this woman who's from Maine, and she's being held in New Jersey, and now she's going to be coming to Maine. And so then the next morning, Susan and I spoke on the phone, and, part of what made this story really fun to cover was because it was kind of a mystery, and you never knew what was going to happen next. And we didn't know where Kaci was going to be, but we thought, well, she's probably going to be at Fort Kent at some point. So Susan said, I think you should go to Fort Kent. So I went up to Fort Kent, and I got there in the afternoon, and at that point, it's still unclear where Kaci Hickox is. We know she's in Maine. She does not appear to be in Fort Kent yet, but a lot of members in the community were very worried. At the university there, Kaci Hickox had a boyfriend that she was living with. He was a nursing student there, and when the school and students got wind that Kaci was going to be coming into town and they were going to be living together, they got very nervous about having him at the school because they were afraid that maybe he would bring Ebola onto the campus. So by the time I got there, basically the school had said, he has agreed to take online courses for 3 weeks. He, after the fact, said that it was not a voluntary thing, that basically the school said, you have to do this. So very interesting because he's a nursing student, so he's in a medical profession. And this is going against what the federal CDC protocol is at this time, which is just basically saying that no one needs to be in quarantine unless they are showing symptoms of Ebola. But anyway, so this, when we arrive in Fort Kent, we do a story about what's the reaction like at the University of Fort Kent. I speak to the police chief, who all day long has been fielding phone calls from concerned residents. And he says, that basically it's gone from him being concerned about the community to him being concerned about Kaci, because people are threatening Kaci and her boyfriend. So that was the next story we did, was just, how is this community in Maine feeling about this woman who's probably going to be coming there soon, because we still don't know where she is.
Right. Then, so here we have them now in Fort Kent, and then we start to have dealing with the state reaction to this, which is that as soon as the state learned that Kaci was coming to Maine, they adopted protocols that were more stringent than the federal CDC guidelines, and they those protocols said that anyone who treated an Ebola patient should self-quarantine for 21 days, even if you're asymptomatic. Correct.
Right.
And so then we have the state saying that. We have Kaci and her boyfriend up in Fort Kent, and we are starting to see, as a small news operation, and so many press in Maine, Sharon from Channel 8 can probably say this, but we were getting calls from people around the country who wanted Patty and Mal and some of our reporters to explain what was going on. So we were fielding calls left and right. We're trying to figure out what the state's next step is going to be, dealing with Kaci and her boyfriend, and how are they going to respond to it. So Patty was pretty much staked out in front of her house, as were so many media outlets, an ever-growing presence of them, staked out.
It was interesting because the first day that I arrived there, well, the morning after I arrived there, there were maybe 3 or 4 other reporters hanging out at her house. She still wasn't there. We were knocking on the door. No one was answering. And it was the following day. I mean, I remember actually speaking to Susan in the morning, because we still didn't know where Kaci was, and then Susan got a tip that she was in Freeport, which I'm actually from Freeport. So the irony was that I had traveled, 5 hours to Fort Kent, and then so we were saying, do I need to go back to Fort Kent? Is that where she is?
Freeport, yeah.
Or sorry, to Freeport, is that where she is? And then I think I called the police chief, and he said she's in Fort Kent. He knew, and she also appeared on the Today Show in the morning through Skype, and that's how the media found out. So yeah, the media went from that first day of just a few of us. The next day, I remember turning down her road, and there was this long stream of cars. And so I had to park my car kind of where I could see her house in the distance and kind of like keep an eye on it. But a lot of media were there.
Yeah, and just to be clear about Kaci, I think one thing I left out that's so important about her in the middle of this is that she really, at this time of hysteria, she really exhibited courage and integrity and just professionalism in the face of all of this. And while even some healthcare workers were criticizing her, I mean, my daughter is a nurse, and my daughter I was surprised to hear my daughter say, that woman, why isn't she going into the quarantine? Why isn't she cooperating? Why is she seeking this limelight for herself? There was sort of this resentment, which was surprising, but as it turned out. But what Kaci was saying is that, these protocols by the state of Maine were not scientifically, medically just or constitutionally just, and that she is a healthcare worker. She had watched children die in Sierra Leone. She had written about this in the Dallas Morning News, how poignant this was, how difficult, and in a poignant way how this affected her and was the most grueling thing she'd ever done in her life. Why would she then come to Maine and subject her friends and neighbors and children to an exposure?
Right. And so, basically, so when she's here and we all know it, we know that the state wants her to stay in this home quarantine. And she has said, I'm not going to be bullied by politicians for something that, there's no medical, it goes against, medical logic and reasoning and the federal CDC guidelines. So the next thing we were looking to was, okay, well, she said that she's not going to abide by this quarantine. When is she going to break it? How is she going to do it? And how is the state going to respond? So it was that morning where there was just a ton of media at her house that, I was sitting in the car and I was talking to Susan, because every day, throughout the day we were checking in, trying to anticipate what's going to happen next, what's our coverage going to be. And as I'm talking to Susan, trying to keep an eye on the house, all of a sudden Kaci rides by on her bike.
You guys may remember, this is how she broke her quarantine. So, you know, this has led to one of the most surreal moments of reporting where, you know, I said, Susan, she's riding on her bike. What do I do? You know, she said, and Susan, I don't know. I was like, oh, I'll call you later. You know. So then, you know, Kaci goes by with her boyfriend on their bike, and then there had been a couple state police troopers parked outside of her house just to monitor her movements. They follow Kaci, and then all these other reporters' cars start following. So I decided I'm just going to follow the herd, you know. So I turn around, and it's the world's slowest car chase because they're on bikes, and we're just going down this hill, watching these bikers, you know. And then finally, Kaci and her boyfriend, they turn down this bike path that is wide enough for a car, but it's not meant for cars. So one state trooper follows her, as do a bunch of photographers. They start running after her. And again, I'm in that herd mindset, so I grab my gear and I start running to see if I can get audio. And then I realize, wait a minute, I'm never going to catch this bike, you know. And really what we need to find out is what is the state going to do? What's the response? And so there was a state trooper who stayed behind, and I asked him, you know, what are you guys going to do? Are you going to arrest her? And he said, we can't do that. All we can do is monitor her movements. So that was a good answer. So then after that, I went back and staked out at her house so I could get her when she returned. So that was another opportunity to get Kaci's perspective on this. And she just kind of reiterated, you know, this quarantine doesn't make any sense, and I'm not going to abide by it. And it's okay for me to go for a bike ride.
Yeah, and the same day as the bike ride was the day that Commissioner Mary Mayhew from DHHS held a news conference to say that, I think that's right, that the state would seek a court order to require Kaci to stay in her house and abide by the quarantine. So it was that was a crucial day in the week of the juxtaposition of the state official response and Kaci going on the bike ride.
Because Kaci said that she had tried to compromise with the state, you know, to do daily health monitoring, but not to have to stay in her house. And when she took that bike ride, that's when it was clear that, you know, communications had broken down. Yeah.
Right. So one of the critical parts after that, probably what we should say too, this was a really fun week for us. It sort of like was 24/7 news and a small team, and the rest of our reporters were also helping us go to news conferences in Augusta, and Mal Leary was absolutely critical because he was working the back channels of trying to figure out, okay, now that Mary Mayhew has had the news conference, where is something going to be filed in court? We had no idea where we might need to deploy more people, and I'm sure the other media were also working on that too. So he's working that, and in the meantime, one of the crucial things that I think happened during that week that turned things, that set Maine as an example in the end, was that our medical community came out with a very powerful letter, a letter to the editor, in which we had former CDC director, state CDC directors, doctors, the Maine Medical Association, and other organizations, just explaining what the boundaries really should be, and sort of taking the position of Kaci that, you know, this is not highly infectious and that she's asymptomatic. And so they granted interviews to us. We did a piece about that, and that was, I think that also, the same day, about the same day.
What was really interesting, what was happening at the state, what made this an interesting story was because the state had, you know, leading up to this, as Susan was saying, you know, the nation was watching the Ebola epidemic, and, you know, from a distance, but also, you know, there were lots of local stories about, you know, what are hospitals doing to prepare. So we had done stories about, you know, are hospitals prepared, and we always got the message, yes, we got to see hospital protocols. We had state officials saying that, you know, the CDC was prepared. So the messaging up until this point, until Kaci landed in Maine, was that we are ready, we've got it. And then she arrives, and all of a sudden everything changes. And so, you know, the state changes its protocols. Even though Kaci tested negative for Ebola, the state said they didn't trust the test. So there was just a lot of mixed messages coming from the state, and I think that's part of the complaint from the medical community, was that there was not a strong, clear message that was kind of trying to tame some of the hysteria that was erupting with Kaci here.
Right, yeah, their point was that the more you try to isolate her, the more the fear goes on. There were actually, even as I recall, doctors in Fort Kent whose patients were canceling their appointments because they were worried that this person was among them. So that was part of the letter as well. And then on Friday, that was nicely wrapped up for us at the end of the week. There was this judge's decision, Judge Charles Laverdiere issued a decision after the on the state's position, and he basically took the point of Kaci. He said that the state had not met its burden to prove by clear and convincing evidence that limiting Kaci's movements to the extent the state requested to protect other individuals from infection made sense.
Right, and I mean, it was a huge, a huge decision, and basically, I mean, the fact that the judge upheld kind of what sort of the medical community had been saying. I mean, it's hard to say, what, the impact, to be clear on what the impact that Kaci had, but I mean, if you look at some states were adopting protocols that went beyond federal CDC guidelines, and after this happened, I think this decision kind of helped quell those motivations, and you didn't see states starting to adopt these policies that did not match what the federal, that went above and beyond what the federal guidelines were.
Right. So it was a huge day for us. It was a really fun story to cover for that week. It was really nice that it sort of started over the weekend and ended by a Friday. Very convenient for us, but and for the other press. I know some stations stayed up longer even after the judge's decision because they really wanted to speak to Kaci and they wanted to see still what might happen in the community. And after that, amazingly. I think that the timing was interesting because it turned out, I think the last statistic I read was there were something like 15,000 people who were infected with Ebola at the peak, something like that. And by the time this decision came down, after her time of exposure had expired, it sort of dissipated. There were some cases, and then in December, she and the Ebola workers were named, Times People of the Year. So it was quite something. Although we should point out that the value for journalists, the role for the journalists, it was also, this case also illustrated how the media can, I'm saying can, rise to its highest and best use, which is this, that the hysteria did seem to be quelled after Kaci's leadership on it, really. And Now in New Hampshire, you have, just a few weeks ago, Governor George Christie from New Jersey and Governor LePage at an event in which Kaci Hickox's name comes up, and Christie, because he had been ground zero for her, and Governor LePage, because she had also been here, sort of taking a crack at Kaci Hickox and saying, oh, she's this unwelcome gift. And Governor Chris Christie says to Governor LePage, and says, you can have her back. Well, Kaci has since moved to Oregon. She's gotten married to her boyfriend. And Kaci, a reporter from the Bangor Daily News, called her up to tell her about this conversation that the governors had. And her response was, what? Don't they know I won that court case? So.
Do you guys have any questions about the Kaci Hickox story or about any of the other work that we do?
A couple aspects. How did she, in fact, get from New Jersey to Fort Camp? Was that from the federal darkness?
Great.
It was by car. I think initially it was going to be by a private plane, and then they decided car. And I think
state employees drove her. I think it's unclear to me. I think New Jersey state employee drove her here, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure.
I'm not exactly
Do you know,
sure
Sharon? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And secondly, what was the Dallas connection? Because right around that time or just before, there's been that gentleman, a native of Sierra Leone, who went into the hospital and talked about where he'd been, and they sent him home, and he came back and his husband died.
Right.
So in Texas, there was a lot of hysteria. But why did Kaci's story, why was she writing further?
I believe she's from Texas.
And might have gone to school there as well. I'm not sure.
I think she worked there also,
yes.
but I think she was from Texas, and that's why it originated there in that paper.
Yeah. I worked with the AG's office, and for about 10 years, I was the chief legal advisor to the CDC. I retired from that position in 2012 before this case arose. And I followed the case very carefully. Our office did not recommend for the case. And I think there are many failings with this case. But the biggest one until the court decision by Justice Verdier was the failure of the rule of law. As you probably know, this day I'm worried that cases like the Hickox case put the state of Maine in a bad light in front of the courts because they think that perhaps they're politicizing cases if you look at solely from a medical standpoint. But you are quite correct. There was not a affirmative evidence which would support the notion that somehow this lady was at all symptomatic or at all transmitting a communicable disease. So it's a pretty sad case. I'm glad the court decided the way it did, but I think it's a real black eye in the state of Maine because a lot of the senior officials misled the public. And the final point I make is that protocols are not the rule of law. We have statutes, we have rules, they have legal force. And Judge Laverdiere properly paid attention to those rules and statutes and ruled what he did.
Yeah. Do you think that Judge Laverdiere's decision, though, in the way he had so researched the whole issue, that he was able to really talk about really the types of infection, when people are most at risk? I mean, he really, even in his opinion, put out so much of that information that was quite amazing.
The Hickox case is unusual because the cases we get, usually we get people with TB, usually airborne pathogens, and they lack judgment, they lack insight, they engage in highly risky behaviors, and we tried many interventions short of going to court to induce them to use proper measures. So we only go to court as a last resort. And in this case, this nurse was thoroughly versed in the health sciences. She used very proper judgment. So really, from my point of view, it was kind of a flux. The case never should have gone to court.
Yes.
My name is Will Solomon. I'm a semi-retired neonatologist. I see one other physician here. I don't know if there are others. As a member of public radio and public broadcasting, I want to congratulate you on an incredibly well done job. You folks are the only voice of sanity in this whole affair. I actually went through all of your articles.
Wow.
And I wanted to make a few comments.
Okay.
These are kind of factual things, but I think it basically says where this should have gone, but it didn't. Okay. The first thing was Kaci herself. This was a woman who had done critical care nursing for years, who had a Master of Science, Master of Nursing, and a Master's of Public Health from the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine that she was awarded in 2001. She had done a fellowship rotation with the CDC in Atlanta in Las Vegas, basically doing epidemiologic field. So when she went into this, she knew exactly what she was dealing with. This is exactly what she had been trained in her public health program to do. I am also an MPH. I know exactly what she went through. And it is unfortunate that ever since the departure of Dora Mills, who was our last MPH-trained director of the Maine CDC, we have had no one in the directorship who has been formally trained in public health. Okay, you can take that to the individuals involved here, okay, as to what their formal training was to make any of these decisions. The second thing is, protocols for this have been well established. And there, in the United States, there are 4 hospitals which are basically, you could call them level 4 biocontainment units to deal with this. Okay? They are in Bethesda, the National Institutes of Health. They are, and that's because it's close to Fort Detrick, Maryland. Second is the University of Nebraska. And you're saying, why the University of Nebraska? Well, it's because they were on a CDC grant to do this. They have the largest unit, which has 10 beds. Okay? There's one at Emory next to CDC, and it has 2 beds. And interestingly enough, there's one in St. Patrick's Hospital in Missoula, Montana, that has organs. Now you're saying, why Missoula, Montana? It's because the Rocky Mountain National Lab that basically does level 4 containment research is there. That's why it's there. Anyway, in 2005, the University of Nebraska basically set up most of the protocols that people are using now. So they have been around that long. They were known to all the players here if they had bothered to look. Okay? The second thing is, you did a story on October 22nd where you talked with August Valenti, who basically does infectious disease at Maine. I had actually, because a number of us were following this, were interested, I called him. I said, well, what are you doing? He said, well, we have basically taken these protocols, we have adapted them in the best Maine way possible. We have reinforced all of this stuff with duct tape. Okay? It works. So at the point that this woman was going to come here, these things have already been pre-planned, discussed, played out, and you guys reported on this. Okay? That was key. All right, next step. So this woman shows up in Newark, and they basically take her and they basically slap a sticker on her forehead to measure her temperature. But what didn't they do? As soon as they found that she had a temp, what should they have done? Well, that's a screening test. You always do a real test, which means take someone's temperature with a thermometer. Okay? It was only once they took her to the University Hospital that they actually took a temperature, which was 98.6. So the fact is, this may never have had to happen at all.
Right.
I mean, this was basically out to lunch. Okay? Then this thing gets made even worse, where basically you have this person, the physician who was running around New York, okay, who used no common sense at all, who basically was on the subway and everything else. So basically the governors of New York and New Jersey hop on the bandwagons, we have to do something, okay? Well, they did something, and the dean of the School of Public Health at Hopkins basically wrote a letter and a phone call, I believe. Christie basically said, what are you doing? This makes no sense whatsoever. Okay, so by this time there were red flags on everything. Okay, so then we get down to, she comes here, and then you get the pronouncement by Secretary Mayhew, or Director Mayhew, who has no medical experience whatsoever, okay, is unable to interpret what she's heard. She shields the Director of Public Health at that time, okay, who likewise has no experience in doing this, even though in her deposition to the court, she said, well, I've read about it, and I kind of know this. Right? Those of us who have taken care of seriously ill patients with infectious disease know exactly what this involves. And it's like, forget the trauma. Just do your job properly and get over it.
I think it shows how, when there's hysteria, that it can just lead to more hysteria, and how it's important that strong leadership is needed. And that was why, part of our jobs as journalists is to ask questions of leaders, and I think that was called into question with this story. And I found it was very interesting, once the judge's decision was made, that one of the comments from Governor LePage was about Kaci Hickox was, I don't trust her. And, I felt like that comment in and of itself as a leader, it's potentially feeding into the hysteria again. But you're right, it just shows, strong leadership is needed. And I guess that's part of what we were looking to, is to ask questions.
Okay, I want to go backwards slightly and then forward to today. Okay?
Maybe we could let some other people engage them as well.
It's just
Do you have a quick question?
Okay, so we did this in 2001 when we hit the anthrax epidemics. Okay? And in this state, we have a plan for dealing with it. Okay? The postscript to this is that there's currently a woman who Scotland, who, having had Ebola, has relapsed. This is over a year later and has severe encephalitis. Okay, and her prognosis is unknown. So all the information is not known. Okay, but anyway, my question is, when you were going through all of this, okay, how far back did you kind of like do the background material of this, as far as how these protocols came to be, and what her background was, as far as her education training?
I mean, I think we researched who she was. You know, I think we looked at what the current guidelines were. I don't remember looking into how those guidelines came to be. But we certainly looked at when we first heard about her, did research on who she was, where she came from.
Yes.
You are covering during that period something that's tremendously fast moving. It's got medical, it's got technology, it's got politics, both state, regional, national, and international. What are the lessons what are your takeaways about how you maintain focus, how you sort the wheat from the chaff, you know, what, as journalists, if we were all budding journalists in this room, what would you tell us?
Wow. I mean, you know, in the end, it really wasn't that difficult to sort out. I mean, for us, the pressure and the fun of it was having to make such focused, clear directions. And you know, I think it didn't help, to your point, that Kaci Hickox was an incredibly credible person, and she was a dedicated person. She was an amazing speaker for it, and the fact that we did have the medical community coming out and we could see what so many people who are experts were saying about it, that made, you know, the political part of it easier. It made it easier for us to prioritize because we had help. And so it didn't end up being that difficult. The distractions were really the people calling us when you're just such a small newsroom and there's so many reporters at the House who are calling us, who want Patty and other reporters to talk. That's really actually very difficult, and Patty and Mal were amazing at handling that.
Yeah, and I think it was also on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, it was clear. You know, okay, we want to know who is Kaci Hickox, what are her motivations and why, what is she trying to say, what is the state's position, why, do they have the authority to do that? And then how does the larger community feel? So it's, you know, Fort Kent, the medical community. I think, so yeah, we kind of knew the voices that we wanted and needed, but on a day-to-day basis, it was just trying to get those answers. So, you know, I went to the courthouse in Fort Kent a few times to try the information with no luck. But it was sort of trying to I think that was part of it, actually. We didn't know which court the decision was going to land in, so it was just trying to figure out how to stay on top of it and make sure we could get information as quickly as possible.
You know, for me, I don't know, not that this helps in the thick of it, but for me, really the judge's opinion was it was just such a beautiful opinion. It was so well researched, it was so thoughtful, people echoed it. I think that goes down really as, you know, if anyone ever wanted to look at what is, you know, if something like this happened again, I think they would look at that because there's a lot of really great information in it.
What do you think was the cause of the governor's animus toward Kaci, aside from just kind of those character traits, but the idea was that she was so well qualified to actually challenge him on this, that she actually did everything needed?
Oh, why did he feel animosity towards her?
Yes, he did take it very personally.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I wonder if he just, you know, I think people felt differently about Ebola, and I think sort of like what Susan was saying in the beginning, I think some people felt like, why didn't she just do the quarantine so that no one would worry? And I think he kind of fell under that camp. And I think he was in a tricky position as the leader of the state.
Well, there's different theories also about whether it was I'm sure, I mean, this is what you hear, whether it was both Governor Christie and Governor LePage sort of took the same view of that, and whether that ended up just being Was it really part of just the general fear that the country was feeling, or was it something else? You know, were there more politics behind it? That's the question.
The majority of the expats who work for NSF, actually the borders are European. And there's one case now in Scotland, and there was a nurse in Spain, I think. But for every Kaci Hickox, there's probably dozens who've served in West Africa and then gone back to Europe. Is there any, in terms of follow-up on this from the journalistic point of view, was there any similar hysteria in Europe, or was the European press more comprehensive or more mature, or were the public health officials over there took it in stride? And I might add that NSF had no lack of volunteers for people to go serve.
You know, it would be interesting to see what has happened. I think there were originally some, right after this, there were some stories sort of with Doctors Without Borders about what the volunteer rate was after this. It would be interesting to check back and see what has happened a year later. There's actually, now seems to be a good time to check in, especially with the case with the Scotland healthcare worker. I'm not sure about the reaction there now, but you know, it is a year later, and we've actually talked about this today. Since we were coming here, we've talked about stories that we might revisit even in Maine to see sort of like, yeah, what's the volunteer rate? What would the nursing school do? Would they do something differently this time up there? That sort of thing.
I wish I can't recall at the time. I seem to remember there were some European health workers that were in quarantine, but I don't remember the circumstances. It never rose to the level of controversy as the Kaci Hickox story, but I can't remember exactly the details.
To address that specific issue, in an interview that Kaci did afterwards, she said, quote, "I was impressed when I read the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control's technical report on the public health management of aid workers returning from Ebola-infected virus areas, which gave clear, concise, evidence-based guidelines for all of Europe which should be emulated everywhere." So that's they already done. My question. Given all of this, okay, do you think, given that our governor is really interested in bringing industry to Maine and high-paying jobs to Maine, that this has impacted what people coming to, prospectively coming to the state would think about coming here, given this circumstance?
What I would say is I don't know the answer to that question, but what I would say is that to me, regardless of what happened and when we were in the thick of it, the ultimate thing to me is the judge's decision. So to me, that's my takeaway anyway, is that was what we were left with in the end, was the judge's decision.
I had a question about the ethics of the information that you share with other reporters from other outlets. I mean, it seems like, you know, there are reporters who work really hard on getting a story, and there are people who kind of come in from the outside, don't know anything about it, and want you to tell them what's gone on, and yet it's been your hard work and your hard reporting. How do you handle that?
You know, I mean, some of the requests were from National Public Radio, and we're affiliated with them, so that felt totally appropriate to share. And then the other requests were usually interviews, you know, and actually that, you know, I think that felt totally appropriate too.
You know what was one cool thing that we didn't describe, Patty can talk about it more, but one cool thing, you know, it's really this is like the most wonderful job in the world to have, to be a public radio reporter. There isn't anything else I would really want to do, and you learn like this especially, you're just learning things all the time. But one of the great joys about being a reporter is the camaraderie occasionally that you have with other reporters. It is just so much fun. I mean, sometimes we're competitors with each other, but on a story like this, there's so much teamwork. And like one of the hilarious stories that I'll let Patty tell it, but it's just that people, they couldn't leave the house of Kaci Hickox because you just didn't know what was going to happen. And so like they would like ask people to call them so they could go get food or go to the bathroom or, you know, right?
Yeah, and it was really fun. And I guess, you know, it's different, you know, if you've got a story that you feel like you've found, yeah, I would feel protective of that and not want to share it. But because this was national, you know, I guess it felt like, yes, we're going to share it with whoever wants to know about it because we are here. But it was great to work with reporters, because we would also, just like with Susan every day, we try to figure out what's going to happen next. Reporters at the scene, we would try to figure out what was going to happen next. But so this, the day that Kaci went for her bike ride, she'd come out. I mean, every day you just really want to talk to Kaci, and you don't know if you're going to be able to. So we spoke to her, but then you still need to hang out outside of her house, because you don't know if she's going to come out and say something more, So I was standing with a couple other, a reporter and a photographer, and the photographer said, we should just slip a note under the door and find out if she's going to come out tonight, And so I said, okay, I'll write the note. And so I wrote a note, and then I knocked on the door, and no one answered. I started to slip the note under the door, and then Kaci's boyfriend, Ted, answered, and I said, is Kaci going to come out tonight? And he said, I don't know. And I said, because I think if we just know, a lot of us will leave if you just tell us, is she going to come out or not? And he said, well, I'll see if I can find out. And about 15 minutes later, he came out and he said, she's not coming out tonight. But then actually he did speak to us a little bit and gave us some information. But it was actually a good lesson for me as a reporter, because I felt like it was such a common sense thing to knock on the door. But, and initially the first few days we had been doing that, but I think you get into these positions where, all the reporters are waiting outside. You know that she knows we're out here and we want to talk to her. So you think, why doesn't she just come out and tell us, Or say, I'm not coming out anymore. And I'm sure from her point of view, she thought, if you want to hang out, be my guest, So it was just a good lesson to, maybe you could just ask for what you want. So it was fun.
But to your point, it really is. Sometimes there are just these great collaborations with the other media, and it makes it even more of a joy to work on a story like this, especially when we're getting such little information about where something going to be filed, and you're told to call the Supreme Court press person, and that they don't have any information for you, and so everyone's just like, wow, where do we go? And helping each other out.
Yes.
You alluded earlier to the fact that there was an atmosphere of fear having to do with Ebola. Take that issue of fear. How do journalists handle that? You guys talk about it, because you obviously can feed into the fear, or you can help to defuse it. Is that an issue that you all spend any time talking about? You get trained? Is anything having to do with that?
Well, yeah, especially for this story, I think absolutely that was critical to the story, is that you do see that has to go into our reporting, and we feel like we have a responsibility about that above all. I think that's the overarching theme, at least for our newsroom, of course.
And you ask, I think as a journalist, you ask yourself that with many stories, and it helps shape how you cover something to make sure that you are, not feeding into fear, but giving information that's helpful.
And responsible.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we have time for one. We have one we're sitting on.
I'll jump in. This is not a question from a general audience. I'm Mark Vogelsang with MPBN, but I just want to reiterate what made us feel about the work that our journalists do. And Patty's reporting on the field, and Susan's as well, has been remarkable. Susan is our deputy who really guides the day-to-day operation of all of our reporters. And both of these guys live right here in this community. They're part of it. They're based in our Lewiston office here. And I'm just very proud of the way I learned a lot today in this discussion about what we covered a year ago. So it seems to me like this is a really helpful look at a story and talks about sort of big issues and also sort of practical issues of how you cover important news stories when they happen. So thank you.
Thank you.
What a wonderful way to express gratitude to all of us. So
Thank you.
Thanks.
Nice job.